This story is based on true events, so watch out and take care. In the beginning of the movie, it shows the time of 1960 when George Foreman's family moves into a new house. The house needed repairs, and there was no electricity there. George's family was quite poor. At night, his mother divides 4 pieces of a burger and shares it with her children. George was very hungry, but his sister Mary tells everyone to pray first. After the prayer, George immediately eats his share of the burger in one bite. He says he is very hungry, and seeing this, Mary gives him half of her burger because she always saw something different in George. At night, George's mother tells him that she can no longer afford his school fees, so he needs to stop fighting with the children. Here we learn that George often used to get into trouble. The next day at school, he tries to answer a question asked by the teacher, but the teacher, seeing his appearance, does not allow him to answer. She asks another student, who looks good, to answer instead. George feels this as well. During lunch, he sits alone, just watching others eat because everyone is busy with their food, and no one likes to talk to him. Then a boy starts bullying him. At first, George tolerates it, but then he can't take it anymore and punches the boy hard. Just then, the teacher arrives. George starts running from there. After this, he is expelled from school. Time passes, and George grows up. George becomes quite rebellious, and he starts stealing with his friends. One day, outside a bar, George and his friends see a man wandering in a drunken state. George decides to rob him, but then he realizes that the man is actually a police officer, and he had disguised himself to catch thieves. Seeing this, George and his friend run away, and the police with their dogs start chasing George. George hides in a house and covers himself with dirty sewer water to avoid being found by the police and their dog. It works, and the police do not find him, so George returns home. One day, George sees an ad on TV stating that children who have been expelled from school will not only receive vocational training in the Job Corps, but will also be provided food, shelter, and even money. George tells his mother about it, and says he wants to go there. His mother tells him that she believes in him and that he will surely achieve something. The next day, George arrives at the Job Corps in California. The guards at the gate tell him the rules of the job. Once inside, George starts arguing with his roommate Desmond, which means George has already gotten into another trouble. George opens his bag and finds that his mother has bought new sneakers for him and placed them in the bag, along with a note. Dustpan is standing far away, watching all this. George faces a lot of difficulties during his training. In an electrical experiment, he doesn't perform well, and his classmates start laughing at him, but George looks at them angrily. George tries to study, but Desmond is listening to music, which makes George argue with him. However, during their conversation, their bond starts to improve. Desmond offers George a drink. In fact, Desmond used to drink a lot. He had a drinking addiction. George refuses his offer. Desmond invites George to the cafeteria. When George opens his bag to wear his new sneakers, he finds out that someone has stolen them. George gets very angry and goes with Desmond to the cafeteria. Desmond had a job there because he was very good at math, so he brought his friend to eat free brownies with him. Desmond tells George that after eating, he should report the theft. While George and Desmond are sitting there eating brownies, George sees a student wearing his sneakers. He chases the student and reaches his room, where he beats him up. He almost throws him out of the window, but Doc stops him. George tries to explain the truth to Doc, but Doc doesn't listen to him. Doc gives him 2 options. One, he could be sent to jail, and the other, George could be sent home. George thinks the second option is better, but he doesn't want to leave. He begs Doc not to send him away. Seeing this, Doc feels pity for him and gives him another option. He asks if George can box. George thinks boxing is like street fighting, but Doc tells him it's a professional sport, where you have to stand in the ring and attack your opponent. Then George realizes that Doc is a boxing coach. The next day, George goes to Doc for training. Doc introduces him to his opponent, who makes fun of George. This makes George angry. Doc explains to him that they are not fighting to kill each other, but rather, it's a sport. In the boxing ring, George struggles to fight, and the audience starts laughing at him, which makes George even angrier. George loses the match but shows a lot of aggression and throws the punching bag on the ground, which silences the audience. In the coaching room, Doc tells George to calm down and explains that 6 months ago, he was just as clumsy as George and didn't know how to play, but with continuous training, he became so good. George starts training, but he faces difficulties with his foot positioning and dodging attacks. Doc explains to him that boxing is a strategic sport, and it requires using techniques and thinking. One day, George calls home and tells his mother about his boxing training. His mother thinks he has gone back to fighting, but George explains that boxing is very different from fighting. His mother is not happy with his decision. George fights again in the boxing ring with the same opponent who beat him in his first fight, but this time, the story is a little different. Using his techniques, George easily beats his opponent. Doc is happy to see his improvement. Then George goes to Doc's room and finds out that Doc was also a boxer and had won 24 fights. George shows Doc a boxing magazine with a picture of Joe Frazier and tells him that he also wants to become the world champion. Seeing this, Doc laughs at him because George is in such a hurry to become a world champion. Doc explains that it takes a lot of hard work and proper training to become a world champion. Then George asks Doc about the next Olympics. Doc tells him that the next Olympics is a year away, but George cannot participate yet. He needs to train for at least 5 years. Hearing this, George tells Doc that he will be old by then. The scene shifts to the boxing ring where George is now fighting with a more experienced boxer. George is now 19 years old, and after a year of training, he is ready for the fight. His family is watching the fight, and the audience thinks George will easily lose because of his opponent's strength. However, George proves them wrong, just as his mother always believed in him. George wins the fight and gets a gold medal. After winning the fight, George proudly wears his gold medal around his neck and walks out of the house. He meets a man who congratulates him on winning the gold medal, but then taunts him for holding the American flag after the fight, which caused all the other black athletes to bow their heads in shame. The man shows George a newspaper article about it, which makes George very sad. He goes to his mother and tells her everything. His mother comforts him and says that he will have to win the next championship to earn everyone's respect. George likes what his mother says and decides that he will definitely win the next championship. At the airport, George sees a beautiful girl, Paula, holding a magazine with George's picture on it. George talks to her and tries to get her phone number. At first, Paula hesitates to give it, but finally, she gives it to him. Doc introduces George to his new team members, Dick Sadler and Archie Moore, who were former heavyweights. They tell George that when he wins his championship, everything will feel different. George starts training, and during this time, he begins dating Paula. He masters a lot of things with the help of his coach and friends, and gradually gets closer to his goal. He easily defeats all his opponents. Paula comes to support him in all his matches. George is now very close to his goal, which is to win the heavyweight championship, where he will fight Joe Frazier. During this time, George and Paula get married. After winning his 66th fight, the day comes when Joe Frazier and George Foreman are about to fight for the heavyweight championship. No one believed George would be able to beat Joe, as Joe Frazier had defeated the famous boxer Muhammad Ali 2 years ago, and everyone thought Joe would also defeat George. In the first round, it seems Joe is overpowering George, but George is hitting him with heavy punches. He uses his special technique, the left-hand punch, but as soon as the first round ends, George gets into his form. Although Joe gets a good rest after the first round, this time George starts overpowering Joe. He knocks him down several times, and the referee announces that George has won the fight. Everyone is shocked, but Doc is very happy because George has won the heavyweight championship. During the celebration of his victory, George answers many questions. He meets Desmond and offers him the job of his financial manager. He asks Desmond to stop drinking, and Desmond agrees and throws his drink into a nearby fountain. At the party, George notices a beautiful girl staring at him. Later that night, she is sitting in George's room. George should have told her to leave, especially after marrying Paula, but he doesn't, and lets her stay the night. The next day, George feels bad about cheating on his wife. Then he watches Muhammad Ali mocking him on TV. Muhammad Ali says that he can knock George out with just one punch. George gets very angry. A few months later, George hosts a family get-together at his home, where his siblings and mother come to meet him. George shows his mother the many cars in his garage. He also meets his daughter, but he doesn't spend enough time with his wife, and they still don't talk properly. Before dinner, George's mother asks everyone to pray. Then George's sister Mary tells everyone that she is expecting, which makes everyone happy. Paula then hears a call and learns that George cheated on her. They start arguing. George tells her that he brought everything she wanted, but Paula says she doesn't need all the things. She just wants George and his time. But George doesn't even look into Paula's eyes and leaves. The scene shifts, and we see that George is about to fight Muhammad Ali this time, and he goes to the African country of Congo. Muhammad Ali is very popular there. That's why when George enters the hotel, he sees Muhammad Ali mocking him in front of people. People laugh at George while listening to Ali. George approaches Muhammad Ali, and the audience thinks that George will finally reply to Ali, but George doesn't say anything and walks away. The boxing match between Muhammad Ali and George begins. Everyone in the audience is shouting, "Ali, knock him out!" George had already defeated Joe Frazier, and in the first round, he seems to be overpowering Ali as well. But Muhammad Ali knew exactly how to beat George. He taunts George and starts making him angry, which causes George to get tired. In the 7th round, George is still holding up well against Ali. He lands many punches, but Ali remains strong. During the break, Dick and Archie tell George to use his anger, but Doc thinks this is bad advice because it is making George tired, while Ali still seems fresh. In the 8th round, Muhammad Ali proves himself again, and George faces his first defeat in his career. After losing to Ali, George reevaluates his life and realizes that his failure was due to his anger and aggression. He calls his wife and apologizes, but Paula is no longer willing to listen to him. She tells him to sign the divorce papers. George not only loses in the boxing ring, but also loses in his personal life. Exhausted and defeated in life, George goes to his mother for comfort. He tells her that he fired Dick and Archie from their jobs because somehow their failure also played a part in his downfall. George's mother comforts him, telling him that he did the right thing to regain his power and respect. George decides to fight 5 fighters at once in the boxing ring. Doc believes this is not a good decision, but George doesn't listen to him. Just then, Muhammad Ali enters the commentator's booth and tries to provoke George again. He calls the audience to cheer for him, which makes George challenge Muhammad Ali to another match. A heated argument begins between the two, but despite all the interruptions, George starts knocking out each of the 5 fighters one by one. After knocking out 3 fighters, George meets Doc in the restroom. Doc tells him that fighting 5 at once is not a good idea. Just as they were talking, George receives a letter informing him that his sister Mary is seriously ill. He rushes to the hospital and tells the doctors that he will give them whatever money they need, but they must save his sister and her baby. However, despite the doctor's best efforts, they haven't been successful yet. Seeing this, George and his family pray. In his prayer, George asks God to take his life instead of Mary's baby, if he needs to take one. The next morning, when George wakes up, he finds out that Mary has given birth to a healthy baby. Both Mary and the baby are perfectly healthy, and the doctors are astonished, calling it a miracle. Mary names her son Little George. George suffers a major defeat in his young fight. His coach criticizes him, saying that he has lost his chance for a rematch with Muhammad Ali. This makes George angry, and filled with aggression, he starts pacing around, not knowing what to do. Then, he hears a voice and asks who it is. Doc and the people around are confused, not understanding whom George is talking to. Suddenly, George collapses, and when he regains consciousness, Doc tells him that he thought George was dead. George then tells everyone that he had a strange dream. After this, we see George in a nearby church, where he tells everyone how he found God. While talking, he notices a girl in the audience, who is very impressed by his humble personality. George tells everyone that from now on, he will only call people towards God, meaning he is leaving boxing. Hearing this, people are shocked, especially Doc, who doesn't want George to do this. Doc tells George that he shouldn't be doing this, but George has already decided to leave boxing. George then goes to meet Muhammad Ali, who is still mocking him. Muhammad Ali advises him that he only needs to win 1 match, and after that, he can fight Ali again. However, George tells him that he is truly quitting boxing. They talk for a while, and then develop a strong friendship. Then George goes to meet his ex-wife Paula. He tells her that he loves his children and apologizes for his past mistakes. After this, George meets the girl again at the church. She still can't believe that a former boxer has quit boxing to become a preacher. George takes the microphone and goes outside the church to talk to people. Many people start mocking him and ask where his anger went. The girl watches him as he does this. Later, they go for lunch, where the girl apologizes to George for misunderstanding him, but now she understands that George is a good person. The girl's name is Mary. Their relationship grows, and George marries Mary. He takes her outside the church and tells her that his dream is to work in this church. 7 years later, we see George standing in the church, talking to the people. Mary and their children are also there. After his session, a woman comes to him with her grandson and asks George to train the child. However, George, smiling, refuses. A few days later, the same child is shown on TV, and it is reported that he was arrested by the police. This makes George regret his decision. George buys a building and asks his financial advisor, Desmond, to invest in it. Desmond has still not been able to quit drinking. The work is completed, and George opens a great boxing club. He hires several coaches, and even creates a room named after Muhammad Ali. A year later, George finds out that Desmond invested all of his money in high-risk stocks, which causes the electricity to be cut off from the boxing club. George meets with the bank manager and finds out that Desmond has squandered all his money. George becomes restless and starts searching for Desmond. His mother tells him to forgive Desmond, but when George sees Desmond drinking in a club, he almost hits him, but then decides to forgive him. Seeing his dwindling money, George falls into depression. He even works in a sauce ad. The bank has seized all his property, but despite all of this, his financial situation doesn't improve, so George decides to quit preaching. He tells his wife, Mary, that he has asked a friend to preach in his place because he can't preach without money. George then once again asks Doc to train him. Doc initially refuses, but after George convinces him, Doc agrees to train him again. Doc tells him that when George left boxing, his heart broke. Doc tells George to first lose weight. George starts training with his daughter. His gym clothes are so tight that he almost gets stuck in them. People around him start mocking him, but George finds everything very difficult, and during this tough time, Mary continues to support him. After following a proper diet and heart training, George finally gets back into shape. He goes to Doc, who starts training him again, but George's speed and techniques have worsened. Doc tells him that with time, he will correct his techniques. One night, Mary has a dream. In the morning, she tells George that she dreamed that God would give him respect in the boxing ring again, so he can call people to God with that respect. The day comes when George decides to return to the boxing ring. Doc tells him to take off his robe. At first, George hesitates, but when he removes the robe, everyone sees that he has gained a lot of weight. The match begins, and his opponent tries to overpower him, but George doesn't let that happen. In the second round, he easily defeats his opponent, but the match continues. George tells the referee to stop the fight, and announces that George has won because his opponent's condition is worsening. The announcement is made that George has won the fight, and everyone starts talking about him. His picture appears on magazine covers, and George has regained the respect of people once again. At 42 years old, George Foreman faces champion Evander Holyfield in the boxing ring. Despite trying hard, George loses to Evander. George goes with Mary to the bank, where everyone applauds him for earning $12 million despite his loss. Mary is very happy to see this, but George tells her that his work is not yet finished. 3 years later, Michael Moore defeats Evander Holyfield, and now George is going to face him. No one believes that 45-year-old George Foreman can defeat 26-year-old champion Michael. The match starts, and we see Michael Moore, who has won 35 fights without a loss and is a heavyweight champion, is overpowering George. They have a fierce fight for 8 rounds. Doc is confused, wondering if George can win this fight. But in the final round, George knocks out Michael Moore with a right-hand punch, and no one can believe that 45-year-old George Foreman has won the fight. He thanks Doc, and Doc thanks him in return, because George is the only person in boxing history to win the heavyweight championship at the age of 45. Doc is hired by a big boxing organization due to his great coaching. The friendship between George and Muhammad Ali lasts until Ali's death. They talked almost every day. George Foreman still works at a church in Houston and also runs his boxing club. This inspiring movie ends here, teaching that one should never give up and keep moving forward, even if it's just 1 or 2 steps. Making a video takes a lot of effort, so if you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the like button.